The morning of September 21st, 1943 dawned gray and cold over the waters north of Hokkaido. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Sands stood in the cramped conning tower of USS Spearfish, his breath visible in the damp air, watching through the periscope as a Japanese convoy crawled across the horizon. 7 merchantmen, 3 escorts, all steaming southwest toward the home islands. His fingers tightened on the periscope handles. This was his chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind him, the torpedo men worked in practice silence, checking settings, verifying angles. In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 18 electric torpedoes rested in their tubes, weapons so new that most of the crew had never seen one fired in combat. No wake, the briefing officers had promised at Pearl Harbor. No turbine exhaust trail pointing back to your position. Just silent death sliding through the water at 29 knots. Sands had his doubts. Every submarine commander in the Pacific had learned to doubt promises about American torpedoes. For nearly 2 years, they had fired weapons that ran too deep, exploded too soon, or refused to explode at all. The Mark 14 had become a bitter joke whispered in wardrooms from Brisbane to Midway. Men had died because torpedoes designed in peacetime secrecy had never been properly tested. But this, the Mark 18, was supposed to be different. Based on captured German technology, built by Westinghouse in a frantic 15-week rush, delivered to the fleet with assurances that finally, the submarine force had a weapon worthy of the war they were fighting. Sands gave the order. Fire 1. The Spearfish shuddered slightly as compressed air drove the first torpedo from its tube. Through the periscope, Sands watched for the telltale wake that would mark its passage. Nothing. Just gray water and the oblivious convoy. He counted seconds, calculated range, waited for the explosion that would signal impact. Instead, the torpedo suddenly broke the surface 300 yards ahead, porpoising like a wounded fish before diving again. Then it fishtailed violently and slammed into the outer torpedo door with a metallic shriek that echoed through the submarine's hull. 7 more times that morning, Sands fired the Mark 18s. 1 sank immediately after launch. 1 broached and ran wild toward the convoy, forcing Spearfish to crash dive to avoid detection. 3 fishtailed at launch and vanished, their fates unknown. 7 missed astern, their courses erratic and unpredictable. When Spearfish limped back to Midway weeks later, his squadron commander's report was blunt. Results were disappointing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Disappointing was a careful word, chosen to mask the rage that submarine commanders felt toward the Bureau of Ordnance, the bureaucrats who had spent 20 years developing weapons that betrayed the men who fired them. But disappointment was a luxury the Pacific Submarine Force could no longer afford. By the fall of 1943, American submarines were finally turning the tide against Japanese shipping. The torpedo scandal, nearly 2 years of failed attacks and wasted opportunities, had at last been resolved. The Mark 14's depth-keeping problems, its premature magnetic explosions, its contact exploders that shattered on impact without detonating, all had been identified and fixed through the stubborn persistence of submarine commanders who had tested their weapons themselves when the Bureau refused to believe their combat reports. And now came the Mark 18, promised as the future of submarine warfare. Electric propulsion, no wake, no exhaust trail, a weapon that could strike from invisibility, giving no warning to the enemy, leaving no trail for escorts to follow back to the firing submarine. The theory was perfect. The reality, as Eugene Sands and Spearfish had discovered, was something else entirely. To understand what the Mark 18 electric torpedo represented and why the Japanese never truly grasped its implications, one must first understand the peculiar doctrine of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with submarines designed primarily as fleet auxiliaries, scouting weapons meant to shadow enemy battleships and strike at carriers. Attacking merchant shipping, the unglamorous work of strangling an enemy's logistics, was beneath the samurai spirit that infused imperial naval doctrine. The Americans, despite pre-war plans that also emphasized fleet actions, had been forced by circumstances into an entirely different kind of war. With the Pacific Fleet's battleships gutted at Pearl Harbor and the Japanese racing across the western Pacific, American submarines became by necessity commerce raiders. Their mission was not glorious. Sink tankers, sink freighters, sink troop transports. Choke the Japanese Empire by severing the maritime arteries that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron, or from China. It was brutally effective. By the time the Mark 18 entered service, American submarines were already beginning to strangle Japan's war economy. But the work was dangerous beyond measure. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine might have been inadequate, their escort forces undermanned and poorly equipped, but their pilots and depth charges were deadly enough. A submarine surfaced in daylight to attack a convoy was gambling its entire crew's lives on the assumption that it could strike, dive, and escape before escorts reached it. This was where the wakeless torpedo promised to change everything. The Mark 14, for all its newly corrected problems, still betrayed its position the moment it was fired. A trail of bubbles from its alcohol-fueled steam turbine marked a white line across the water, pointing directly back to the submarine that had fired it. Experienced Japanese lookouts could spot these wakes from miles away, giving precious seconds of warning to maneuver, giving escort commanders an exact bearing to the hidden attacker. An electric torpedo, by contrast, left almost nothing. Its battery-powered motor produced no exhaust, no bubbles, no telltale disturbance. It was, in theory, the perfect ambush weapon. Silent death sliding through the dark water, arriving without warning, offering no clue to the submarine's position. The Germans had developed this technology years before the war, refining their G7E electric torpedo through the late 1930s. When captured examples of the G7E washed ashore in British-controlled waters in 1941, technical intelligence teams had scrambled to examine them. The design was elegant, sophisticated, decades ahead of American efforts. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, had seen the potential immediately. He ordered the Bureau of Ordnance to develop an American copy with maximum priority. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, had been working on electric torpedoes since 1915 with characteristic peacetime languor. Their Mark 20 design was still years from completion. King had no patience for this.
In March of 1942, he directed the project to Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company with orders to copy the German design as closely as possible and deliver production weapons by summer. Westinghouse attacked the problem with industrial fury. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, redesigning German components to fit American manufacturing standards, developing new lead-acid batteries when the German design proved incompatible with American battery chemistry. The contract called for 2,000 Mark 18s, plus worlds, exercise heads, tools, spares, and workshop equipment. 15 weeks later, in mid-June of 1942, the first test models arrived. It was an astonishing achievement, a demonstration of American industrial capacity that would have been impossible in peacetime, but speed at its costs. The batteries, manufactured by Exide, produced excessive hydrogen gas, a fire hazard aboard any ship and potentially lethal in the confined spaces of a submarine. The motors overheated. The control mechanisms, pneumatic rather than electric, to save development team, were temperamental and prone to failure. Production quality varied wildly as Westinghouse struggled to scale up manufacturing. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, the problems were gradually addressed. Forced ventilation systems to disperse hydrogen. Improved motor cooling. Tighter quality control. By September of 1943, the Mark 18 was declared ready for combat service. 2 submarines received the first operational loads. Eugene Sands took spearfish into the waters north of Japan. And Dudley "Mus" Morton, the legendary commander of USS Wahoo, took his boat into the Sea of Okhotsk with orders to interdict Japanese shipping between the home islands and the Asian mainland. Morton was one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Pacific, a man whose previous patrols had sunk 27 ships totaling more than 100,000 tons. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, would later command USS Tang and earn the Medal of Honor. Between them, they had perfected the art of the surface night attack, charging into convoys at high speed, firing spreads of torpedoes at multiple targets, then diving and evading while escorts scrambled to respond. If anyone could make the Mark 18 work, it was Moose Morton. On the morning of October 5, 1943, Morton brought Wahoo to periscope depths of the west coast of Honshu and spotted a large dropship steaming north without escort. The Conron Maru, over 7,000 tons, packed with Japanese soldiers being rotated back from the continent. Through his periscope, Morton watched the ship's silhouette sharpen as it closed. He ordered a spread of Mark 18's fire. The torpedoes ran through. No wake appeared on the surface. The Japanese lookouts saw nothing until the first explosion tore into Conron Maru's huge midships. Then a second impact, and a third. The ship listed sharply, her decks erupting in chaos as soldiers scrambled for lifeboats. Within minutes, she had capsized and sank, taking 544 men down with her. Japanese news agency Domei reported the sinking days later, confirmation that reached American intelligence through radio intercepts. But they reported only that the ship had been sunk by an American submarine. No mention of how. No description of torpedo wax or lack thereof. No indication that the Japanese had noticed anything unusual about the attack. This was the beginning of the Mark 18's combat career. A weapon that promised to revolutionize submarine warfare, delivered to the fleet all finished, tested in combat under the most desperate circumstances of the Pacific War. And unlike the earlier torpedo scandals where failures were obvious and catastrophic, the Mark 18's limitations were subtle, harder to quantify, easier for bureaucrats to dismiss. Submarine commanders knew the truth. The Mark 18 was slower than the Mark 14, 29 knots versus 46, giving targets more time to maneuver. Its range was shorter, 4,000 yards versus 9,000. Its batteries were sensitive to water temperature, losing performance in cold waters. The torpedoes had to be withdrawn from their tubes regularly for recharging, a maintenance burden in the cramped working spaces of a submarine on patrol. Unlike the Mark 14 before it, the Mark 18 had no protection against circular runs, the nightmare scenario where a torpedo's gyroscope failed and sent it curving back toward the submarine that fired it. This defect, which the Bureau of Ordnance had never adequately addressed, would eventually claim at least one American submarine with terrible certainty and possibly others. But the Mark 18 had one undeniable advantage. It was worthless. And in the hands of aggressive commanders willing to work around its limitations, that single characteristic made it devastatingly effective. By the end of 1943, Mark 18s accounted for 70% of all torpedoes fired by American submarines in the Pacific. By 1945, as production ramped up and the stocks of Mark 14s dwindled, 70% of submarine torpedoes were electric. They sank approximately 1 million tons of Japanese shipping, roughly one-fifth of the total destroyed by American submarines during the war. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained largely ignorant of what was killing them. Their anti-submarine warfare doctrine had been inadequate from the war's beginning, a conscious choice born of the same offensive-minded naval philosophy that prioritized battleship duels over convoy protection. Merchant shipping was given minimal escort, often used a single-eyed destroyer or converted gunboat for an entire convoy. ASW equipment was primitive, sonar unreliable, depth charges often ineffective. Training was minimal, tactics reactive rather than systematic. This institutional blindness meant that even when Japanese lookouts saw torpedo wax and when they didn't, the distinction made a little impression on after-action reports. As ship sank was as ship sank, whether the attack came from a visible wake or from nowhere. There was no systematic analysis, no intelligence assessment comparing different attack patterns, no recognition that American submarines had introduced a weapon that fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of underwater warfare. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The officers who staffed the Grand Escort Command headquarters in Tokyo, established belatedly in November of 1943, worked in a state of perpetual crisis management. Their charts showed losses mounting week by week. Tankers torpedoed off Borneo. Freighters sank in the Formosa Strait. Troop transports going down within sight of the home islands. The red marks on their plating tables multiplied faster than replacements could be built. But the reports arriving from convoy commanders and surviving merchant captains followed a dreary pattern of sameness. Submarine sighted. Torpedo tracks observed. Explosion. Ship lost. Whether those torpedo tracks were visible or invisible, whether they came with warning or without, made little difference to men trying to manage an empire's collapsing logistics with inadequate forces and no systematic doctrine. In August of 1943, one staff officer had noted an uptick in sinking rates that seemed to correlate with something new in American submarine tactics. The numbers were undeniable. Since the late spring, shipping losses had exceeded 70,000 gross tons per month, far beyond the predictions made by pre-war naval strategists. But was it new tactics? Better training? More submarines on patrol? Improved torpedoes? The data offered no clear answers, and the Grand Escort Command lacked both the resources and the institutional framework to investigate properly. The truth was hidden in the details that never made it into official reports. The merchant captain who survived the sinking of his ship rarely knew whether he had seen torpedo wax or not. The chaos of an attack, the focus on survival, the trauma of watching Gone's vessel break apart, these experiences left little room for careful observation. And even when lookouts reported seeing nothing before the explosions, their testimony was easily dismissed. Perhaps they had been looking the wrong direction. Perhaps the sun's glare had obscured the wax. Perhaps in their panic they had simply failed to notice. The Japanese Navy's own submarine force, meanwhile, had developed excellent Walkley's torpedoes of their own. The Type 985, with its oxygen propulsion system, left minimal wake and was far superior to anything the Americans possessed in terms of speed and range. Japanese submarine commanders knew the tactical advantage of Walkley's weapons. But this knowledge never translated into defensive doctrine for their surface forces. The compartmentalization of Japanese military thinking, the rigid separation between offensive and defensive operations, meant that lessons learned by submarine crews remained isolated, never incorporated into convoy protection procedures. And so American submarines continued to kill Japanese ships, sometimes firing weapons that left clear wax, sometimes firing weapons that left no trace, with the victims rarely able to distinguish between them. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane understood this better than most. After surviving the loss of Oahu in October of 1943, when Japanese aircraft depth-charged his boat as it tried to escape through the La Perouse Strait, O'Kane had been given command of USS Tang, a brand-new Balao-class submarine commissioned in October. He inherited not just a ship but the tactical philosophy that he and Mus Morton had developed together. Aggressive surface attacks. Multiple targets per engagement. Maximum damage before diving to evade. Tang departed Pearl Harbor on January 22, 1944, for her first war patrol. O'Kane's orders sent him to the waters around the Carolina and Mariana Islands, hunting grounds rich with Japanese shipping but also heavily patrolled. In his torpedo rooms, a mixed load. Some Mark 14s, reliable now after their problems had been fixed. Some Mark 18s, slower and shorter ranged but Walkleys. On the morning of February 17, Tang detected a convoy. 2 freighters, 5 smaller vessels, 4 escorts. O'Kane tracked them through the pre-dawn darkness, calculating speeds and angles, positioning his boat for an attack. The non-escort appeared suddenly at 7,000 yards, closing fast. Tang crashed the bed, and 5 depth charges followed her down, close enough to rattle light fixtures and send men sprawling but not close enough to rupture her pressure hull. When the escort moved off, O'Kane brought tank back to periscope depths and resumed his approach. The range closed to 1,500 yards. He fired 4 torpedoes, 3 Mark 14s and 1 Mark 18. 3 impacts. The 6,800-ton Joten Maru listed sharply, then sank by the stern within minutes. The Mark 18s left no visible wake, but in the confusion of the attack, with escorts charging around and depth charges detonating, the Japanese convoy commander could not have identified which torpedoes came from where. All knew was that somewhere beneath the waves, an American submarine was killing his ships. 5 days later, tank caught another convoy in darkness. 3 cargo ships, 4 escorts. O'Kane brought his boat to the surface, gambling that the night and his low silhouette would keep him invisible. At 1,500 yards off the port bow of the lead freighter, he fired a spread of 4 Mark 18s. The Fukuyama Maru, 3,600 tons, disintegrated. The torpedoes hit from bow to stern in rapid succession, their torpex worlds, 50% more powerful than TNT, tearing the ship's structure apart. Survivors later reported that the explosions came without warning. No wake had been visible in the darkness. The ship simply erupted in flame and broke in half. By dawn, O'Kane had repositioned for another attack. This time the target was Yamashimo Maru, 6,800 tons. The escort had moved away from its covering position, leaving a gap that tank slipped through. 4 more Mark 18s. The first hit the stern. The second hit just aft of the smokestack. The third hit forward of the bridge and produced a secondary explosion so violent that the ship was lifted badly from the water before settling back, twisted and burning, to sink within minutes. Tan's first patrol set the template for what would become her legendary career. 16 hits out of 24 torpedoes fired. 5 ships sank. An aggressive commander using a mix of conventional and electric torpedoes to maximum effect. And in every attack, the Japanese survivors reported the same experience. Explosions arriving with minimal warning, ships destroyed before escorts could respond effectively. But still the Japanese command failed to recognize the pattern. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Part of this failure stemmed from a larger strategic blindness. By early 1944, Japan's industrial capacity was beginning to collapse under the weight of American bombing and submarine interdiction. Aluminum was scarce. Oil was rationed. Factories that should have been building escort vessels were instead repairing damaged capital ships or constructing the super battleships that Japanese naval doctrine still prioritized. The nation that had started the war with 7,600,000 tons of merchant shipping now struggled to maintain even basic supply lines. In this context, the specific technical characteristics of American torpedoes seemed almost irrelevant. Whether submarines were using improved Mark 14s or new Mark 18s, whether the torpedoes left wakes or not, the strategic result was the same. Japanese shipping was dying faster than it could be replaced. The convoy routes from Southeast Asia to the home islands, over 2,500 miles of ocean that had to be traversed under constant submarine threat, became known to merchant sailors as the Devil's Route. Ships sailed in loosely organized convoys with minimal escort, and they died in numbers that made individual tactical details seem like footnotes to an inevitable catastrophe. American submarine commanders, meanwhile, developed preferences based on their own tactical philosophies. Some trusted the faster, longer-ranged Mark 14s for attacks on maneuvering warships.
Others preferred the wakeless Mark 18s for night surface attacks when concealment mattered more than speed. Some boats carried mixed loads. Others loaded exclusively one type or the other. USS Tang, under O'Kane's command, became the most successful submarine in terms of ships sunk per patrol. Her third patrol, in the East China and Yellow Seas during June and July of 1944, achieved one of the most devastating attack sequences of the war. On June 24, southwest of Kagoshima, Tang detected a massive convoy. 6 large ships guarded by 16 escorts. O'Kane closed for a surface attack in darkness. At 2,000 yards, he fired 2 spreads of torpedoes, a mix of Mark 14s and Mark 18s, angled to fan out and cover multiple targets. The explosions came in rapid sequence. What Tang's crew thought were 2 ships sinking turned out to be 4. The torpedoes had found overlapping targets, and the convoy's tight formation had concentrated the destruction. Japanese records later confirmed the losses: Tamahoko Maru, Tainan Maru, Nasusan Maru, and Kenichi Maru. Over 16,000 tons of shipping destroyed in a single engagement. The escorts scrambled to respond, dropping depth charges blindly, their sonar unable to distinguish Tang's hull from the thermal layers and wreckage that cluttered the water. By the time they organized a coherent search pattern, Tang had slipped away on the surface, her low profile and electric silence invisible against the night. The surviving Japanese convoy commander's report made no mention of torpedo wakes or lack thereof. His focus was on the speed and coordination of the attack, the multiple explosions arriving nearly simultaneously, the complete failure of his escorts to detect or engage the submarine before it struck. Whether some of the torpedoes had been wakeless was, from his perspective, less important than the fact that his convoy had been annihilated. This pattern repeated across the Pacific throughout 1944 and 1945. American submarines, now equipped with reliable torpedoes, both conventional and electric, operated with a confidence that would have been unthinkable in the war's early years. They attacked in daylight and darkness. They stalked convoys for days, striking repeatedly until all targets were destroyed or escorts forced them to break contact. They operated so close to Japanese home waters that submarine sailors joked about being able to see Mount Fuji from periscope depth. The Mark 18, despite its limitations, became increasingly popular with submarine commanders. Post-war analysis would show that it actually had a lower hit percentage than the Mark 14, 17% worse against merchant ships, and 250% worse against escort vessels. The slower speed gave targets more time to maneuver, and the shorter range restricted tactical flexibility. But the psychological advantage of wakeless attacks, the sense that one was striking from invisibility, made many commanders willing to accept these trade-offs. What they did not fully appreciate, and what the Japanese never recognized at all, was that merchant ship lookouts rarely noticed torpedo wakes anyway. The vast majority of attacks happened in conditions where wakes were difficult or impossible to see: darkness, heavy weather, poor visibility, or at ranges where the wakes were too distant to distinguish from wave patterns. The Mark 18's wakeless property, so carefully engineered and so highly valued, provided an advantage primarily in a narrow set of tactical circumstances that represented only a fraction of actual combat engagements. But perception mattered as much as reality. American submarine commanders believed in the Mark 18's stealth advantage, and that confidence translated into aggressive tactics. Japanese convoy commanders, meanwhile, struggled with so many overwhelming problems that the distinction between wake-producing and wakeless torpedoes simply did not register as a significant variable in their impossible mission of protecting shipping with inadequate resources. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese merchant marine was in its death spiral. Losses exceeded new construction by ratios that made long-term survival impossible. The Grand Escort Command, despite its efforts to systematize convoy protection, could not overcome the fundamental mismatch between the number of escorts available and the vast ocean areas that needed to be defended. American submarine captains, reading intelligence reports based on decrypted Japanese communications, knew their enemies' convoy schedules and routes with eerie precision. They positioned themselves along predicted tracks and waited for targets to arrive like clockwork. The Mark 18 played its role in this slaughter, one weapon among many in an arsenal that had finally matured into devastating effectiveness. Approximately 9,000 Mark 18s were produced during the war. They accounted for 30% of submarine torpedoes fired in 1944 and 70% in 1945. They sank roughly 1 million tons of Japanese shipping, a significant contribution to the 4.8 million ton total destroyed by American submarines. And through it all, the Japanese Navy never developed a systematic understanding of what they faced. No intelligence report identified the Mark 18 as a distinct weapon system. No tactical doctrine evolved to counter wakeless torpedoes specifically. No training manual taught lookouts how to distinguish between different types of submarine attacks. The weapon that American engineers had rushed into production, that submarine commanders had learned to use despite its flaws, that had been intended to revolutionize underwater warfare, remained essentially invisible to the enemy it was designed to kill. Part 3. The Cost of Truth. The final patrol of USS Tang began on September 24, 1944. Richard O'Kane had requested assignment to the Formosa Strait, one of the most dangerous patrol zones in the Pacific. The waters between Taiwan and mainland China were heavily mined, intensely patrolled, and critical to Japanese logistics. American submarines that operated there did so knowing that escape routes were limited and enemy response times would be measured in minutes rather than hours. Tang loaded a full complement of 24 torpedoes. Most were Mark 18s, chosen by O'Kane for the stealth advantages he believed they provided in the confined, dangerous waters where he intended to hunt. On the night of October 23, Tang detected a large convoy. 3 tankers, 1 transport, 1 freighter, several escorts. O'Kane maneuvered his boat to the surface and charged directly into the middle of the convoy formation, a tactic of shocking aggressiveness that left Japanese escorts confused about where the attack was coming from. At close range, Tang fired spread after spread of Mark 18s. The nearest ship took 2 torpedoes and erupted in flames. The second nearest took 1 and listed heavily. The farthest took 3 and exploded with such violence that secondary detonations suggested ammunition or aviation fuel in her cargo. As escorts finally oriented on Tang's position, O'Kane prepared to attack one of the tankers.
Then his crew realized that both the tanker and the Japanese transport were attempting to ram. O'Kane spun Tang hard, threading between the 2 ships at full power. The Japanese vessels collided with each other in a screaming crash of metal, and O'Kane fired 4 stern torpedoes into the wreckage. Both ships sank within minutes. It was a masterpiece of submarine warfare, the kind of engagement that would earn O'Kane the Medal of Honor. Tang struck from the art of an enemy convoy, sank multiple ships, evaded ramming attempts, and escaped before escorts could coordinate their response. Through the long night, she shadowed the remnants of the convoy, striking again at dawn. 2 freighters, the Kogen Maru and Matsumoto Maru, 6,600 and 7,000 tons respectively, went down under her final Mark 18 attacks. By the early morning of October 25, Tang had expended 23 torpedoes. 1 remained. O'Kane positioned his boat for a final shot at a damaged transport that had been left behind by the convoy. At 2:30 in the morning, the last Mark 18 was fired. It broached immediately after leaving the tube, porpoising to the surface, then curved sharply to the left in a circular run. O'Kane ordered emergency speed and threw the radar hard over, but the torpedo was too close and moving too fast. 20 seconds after firing, it struck Tang's stern near the aft torpedo room. The explosion was catastrophic. Men in the after compartments died instantly as a water flooded in the submarine went down by the stern, settling at 180 feet on the muddy bottom of the Formosa Strait. Of the 9 men on the bridge, 3 managed to swim through the night until rescued 8 hours later. 1 officer escaped from the flooded conning tower. Inside the pressure hull, 78 men crowded forward as the after compartments flooded. Some attempted to escape using Monsenlang's emergency breathing devices designed for exactly this scenario. In the darkness and chaos, with electrical fires adding smoke to the already poisonous atmosphere, 9 men managed to reach the surface from 180 feet down. It was the first and only time during the war that the Monsenlang was successfully used to escape a sunken submarine. A Japanese destroyer picked up the survivors the next morning. They were interrogated, imprisoned, and held until the war's end. Commander O'Kane, even as a prisoner, never revealed to his captors the full extent of Tang's success or the details of American torpedo technology. The Japanese who pulled Tang's survivors from the water knew only that they had captured the crew of an American submarine. They did not know that tank had been the most successful submarine in the US Navy, credited with sinking 31 ships totaling over 227,000 tons. They did not know that the final torpedo had been a Mark 18. They did not know that the weapon system they had never properly identified had used clamped one of the submarines that had devastated their merchant marine. The circular run that sank tank was not unique to the Mark 18. The Mark 14 had the same vulnerability, a gyroscope defect that occurred rarely but catastrophically. USS Tujibe had been lost to a circular run in March of 1944, though the torpedo type was never definitively identified. USS Grunion may have been lost to a circular run of her own torpedo in 1942. The Bureau of Ordnance, despite years of evidence, never adequately solved the problem. For the Mark 18, this defect was particularly tragic because the weapon had been rushed into service precisely to address the failings of earlier American torpedoes. It was meant to be better, safer, more effective. Instead, it carried the same fundamental flaws while adding new complications of its own. The batteries that made it worthless also made it maintenance intensive, temperature sensitive, and shorter ranged than conventional weapons. The electric motor that made it silent also made it slower, giving targets more time to evade. Yet for all its problems, the Mark 18 had achieved its primary mission. It had helped American submarines strangle Japanese logistics. It had sunk hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. It had contributed to the devastation of Japan's merchant marine, a campaign of attrition that by years and had reduced Japanese shipping capacity to less than a quarter of its 1941 levels. And the Japanese had never understood what killed them. In the final months of the war, as American submarines prowled virtually unopposed through Japanese home waters, the distinction between worthless and backup-producing torpedoes had become largely academic. Japan's convoy system had collapsed. Escorts were scarce, often pulled away for desperate last-ditch naval operations. Merchant ships sailed alone or in tiny groups, essentially defenseless, and American submarines sank them at will using whatever torpedoes happened to be loaded. After the war, when Allied investigators interviewed surviving Japanese naval officers, the questions about American electric torpedoes elicited confusion rather than recognition. Some officers remembered that late in the war, submarine attacks seemed to arrive with less warning, but they attributed this to improved American tactics rather than new weapons. Others noted that the intensity of submarine operations had increased dramatically after 1943, but they connected this to the general deterioration of Japanese anti-submarine capabilities rather than any specific technological development. The systematic analysis that would have identified the Mark 18 as a distinct threat had never occurred. The institutional framework for such analysis had never existed. The Grand Escort Command, established too late and with too few resources, had focused on immediate operational problems rather than intelligence assessment. The Naval General Staff, wedded to offensive operations and fleet actions, had never prioritized the defensive warfare that might have detected patterns in submarine attacks. This blindness was emblematic of larger failures in Japanese military doctrine. The same offensive-minded philosophy that led Japan to prioritize battleships over escorts, fleet actions over convoy protection, and individual bravery over systematic tactics, also made it impossible for the Japanese military to adapt effectively to the kind of war they were actually fighting. American submarines were waging a campaign of industrial attrition, methodically destroying the logistical foundation of Japan's war effort. The specific technical characteristics of their weapons mattered less than the systematic application of force across the entire theater. The Mark 18, in this context, was simply one more element in a comprehensive system of destruction. It was not the decisive weapon. It was not revolutionary. It was effective primarily because it was part of a larger framework that included reliable intelligence, aggressive tactics, industrial capacity to produce thousands of torpedoes, and a submarine force that had finally learned through bitter experience how to fight effectively. The men who designed the Mark 18 never intended it to be invisible to enemy intelligence. They intended it to be invisible to enemy lookouts in the moment of attack. That it achieved both was less a triumph of engineering than an indictment of Japan's institutional inability to learn from the war they were losing. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the Mark 18 had been largely surpassed by even newer weapons. Homing torpedoes, faster designs, more reliable systems. The electric torpedo that had been rushed into service in 1943 was already obsolete by years and kept in production only because changing manufacturing lines was more disruptive than building a weapon everyone knew was flawed. It remained in limited service until 1950, used primarily for training. Older S-class submarines, repurposed for training roles, carried Mark 18s to practice stealthy submerged attacks. But by then, the lessons of the Pacific submarine campaign had been thoroughly absorbed, and the specific characteristics of individual torpedo types had faded into historical footnotes. The legacy of the Mark 18 exists primarily in the memories of the men who fired it and the ships it destroyed. In the patrol reports filed by submarine commanders who praised its workless characteristics even as they noted its limitations. In the post-war analysis that carefully documented its lower hit percentages compared to conventional torpedoes. In the survivor accounts from tank and possibly other submarines that were destroyed by their own malfunctioning weapons. And in the silence of Japanese records that never identified it, never recognized it, never developed countermeasures against it. The weapon that was meant to revolutionize submarine warfare succeeded primarily because the enemy never realized it existed. Commander Richard O'Kane, after his release from Japanese captivity, received the Medal of Honor for Tan's final actions. He went on to serve in various capacities in the post-war Navy, testified at Japanese war crimes trials, and eventually retired as a Rear Admiral. His memoirs, Clear the Breach, became essential reading for submarine officers, documenting the tactical innovations that he and Mus Morton had pioneered. In those memoirs, O'Kane wrote about the Mark 18 with a mixture of respect and frustration. He acknowledged its advantages in certain tactical situations. He documented its flaws with the precision of a man who had lost his ship and most of his crew to one. And he never quite resolved the question of whether the weapon's stealth characteristics had been worth its utter compromises. The Japanese officers who survived the war, meanwhile, wrote their own memoirs and stories. They documented the collapse of their merchant marine with statistical precision. They analyzed the failures of their anti-submarine doctrine with painful honesty. They acknowledged that American submarines had achieved operational dominance that made the Pacific War unwinnable regardless of tactical victories elsewhere. But in those Japanese accounts, the Mark 18 appears only as an absence, a weapon that killed without ever being recognized. It was the silent component of a broader catastrophe, contributing to a defeat that would have occurred with or without it. Perhaps that is the final irony of the Mark 18 electric torpedo. It was designed to be invisible to the enemy in the moment of attack. It succeeded beyond its designers' wildest expectations by remaining invisible throughout the entire war. The Japanese Navy never knew what hit them, not because the Mark 18 was so advanced, but because they lacked the institutional capacity to recognize any submarine torpedo as a distinct technical system worthy of specific analysis. The weapon was 1 million tons of Japanese shipping destroyed by a torpedo that was never properly identified. It was the manifestation of American industrial capacity, rushing a flawed weapon into service and making it effective through sheer volume of production. It was the embodiment of tactical doctrine that valued aggression and confidence over technical perfection. And it was proof that in modern warfare, the perception of a weapon can matter as much as its actual capabilities. The Mark 18 electric torpedo sank ships. It killed sailors. It contributed to the strangulation of Japan's war economy. And it did all of this while remaining, to the enemy it was designed to defeat, essentially invisible. Not because it was perfect, but because the Japanese never looked for it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass this up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from US.